From a young age, Colleen James Turner stood out among his peers with his determination and iron discipline. Born into a middle-income family, he understood from an early age that success can only be achieved through hard work. Studies, sports, self-discipline, all this became the basis of his future. His father, a former military man, instilled in him an understanding of duty, honor, and responsibility. Collin grew up in an atmosphere of strict rules where every promise carried weight and words did not differ from deeds. He respected order and aspired to structure, so it's not surprising that his dreams have always been about the army. He wasn't looking for easy ways. He was looking for challenges, and a military career became a natural choice for him. Military service was not just a job for Turner, it was his path. The U.S. Marine Corps became his home, his test, and his pride. Here he went through a tough school of life, where mistakes were not forgiven, and weakness was punished not with words, but with consequences. He participated in combat operations, faced real danger, and lost friends. It was a life in which there was no place for fear, but there was a place for doubt. Sometimes he wondered how much he had changed. Collin was never afraid of difficulties. He was always the first to go where it was most difficult. He had a special inner strength inherent in a true leader, and his colleagues respected him for his steadfastness and determination. But with the pride of service came trials. The injuries, both physical and mental, gradually made themselves felt. He had learned to hide his pain, to keep his emotions under control, but that didn't mean they were gone. Collin's life changed when he met Bree Kristen Kuhn. As an officer in the U.S. Navy, she possessed the same strong character, was determined, single-minded, and accustomed to overcoming difficulties. Their meeting took place at an official event, but from the first minutes it became clear that they were perfect for each other. They understood each other perfectly, two men hardened by their service, who knew what it meant not to give up. Their marriage became a union of two strong personalities united by love and respect. After the wedding, they settled in Florida in the small town of Gulf Breeze, where they soon became parents. For those around them, their life looked perfect. A strong family, a cozy home, a happy couple who had been through a lot together. However, the reality was actually more complicated. Adapting to a peaceful life turned out to be much more difficult than Collin expected. After leaving the Marine Corps, he faced the problem of adaptation. The years spent in hot spots could not pass without a trace. Post-traumatic stress disorder gradually made itself felt, making him withdrawn and at times irritable. He was not the same person as he was known before. There was a heaviness in his eyes that he couldn't handle. Bree continued to serve in the Navy, trying to maintain a balance between work, family, and her husband's support. She did everything she could to keep the house a place of peace. But the tension was building. Collin tried to keep everything under control, but his inner demons wouldn't let go. He didn't sleep at night, sat in the dark for long periods, and sometimes snapped at small things. These were not outbursts of anger, but rather a dull tiredness that gradually grew stronger. From the outside, their lives seemed flawless. A tidy house, happy children, family walks. Everything spoke of well-being. They were smiling, they looked friendly, and no one suspected what was going on behind closed doors. The neighbors looked at them and thought that everything was fine with them. However, in reality, tension was building up within the family. Collin felt like a stranger in his usual life, and Bree tried her best to preserve their world. He tried to get a job, but nothing was satisfying. Office work, production, everything seemed empty to him, too slow, unnatural. He was used to a clear order, to adrenaline, to the fact that every action mattered. Now, it felt like he was stuck in a world that didn't belong to him. The neighbors began to notice the changes. Collin went out less and less, looked thoughtful more and more often. And Bree seemed tired. Friends said they were just going through a difficult period, but no one knew how serious it was. Silence grew inside the house. The children did not understand why their father became more silent, why sometimes he stared into the void, as if he were somewhere far away. Bree tried to protect them from this by pretending that everything was fine, but even she couldn't hide her concern. For others, the family remained a model of stability, but the cracks inside were getting deeper. Collin struggled with himself, but every day this struggle became harder. He couldn't find a place for himself. He felt lost, and no one knew how to help him. Neighbors recalled how one Sunday morning, the family went out for a walk. They looked happy. Collin was holding the children's hands, smiling, and everything seemed to be in order. No one could have imagined that it was just an illusion. A few days later, the news shocked the entire area. Although quarrels were increasingly occurring behind closed doors at home, the family continued to live a seemingly ordinary life for those around them. People thought they were just going through a difficult period, but no one suspected how deep this crisis was. Collin tried to fight, but a storm was raging inside him. He felt like a stranger in a world that he no longer understood, and this feeling became unbearable. And when the illusion of well-being finally cracked, the consequences were irreversible. On September 8, 2021, began as an ordinary day at the Colleen Turner family home in Gulf Breeze, Florida. A light wind stirred the leaves, the sun slowly rose above the horizon, and children's laughter rang in the air. Everything looked familiar, measured, the way a morning should be in an ordinary family. Colleen Turner, as always, got up early, went out on the porch, and breathing in the fresh air, watched the children running around the lawn. Bree Coon looked calm as she concentrated on arranging the plates on the kitchen table. Nothing unusual seemed to be happening, but behind this morning's idyll, there was a tension that had been building up for months. It was intertwined with everyday conversations, barely noticeable glances, and fleeting outbursts of irritation. No one, neither neighbors nor friends, could have predicted that this day would be the last time the Turner family would exist in its former form. Neighbors later recalled that nothing foreshadowed trouble that day. They heard children laughing, saw Collin sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, and Bree hurrying to get the kids ready for school. Everything looked the same as always, but if someone had looked inside the house, they would have noticed that there was tension behind the smiles of the couple. There was a subtle barb in their voices that could only be noticed by those who knew them well enough. They weren't screams, they weren't loud accusations, but the feeling of an electrified atmosphere was growing by the minute. At 12:53 p.m., the first call was received by the 911 service. Bree Coon spoke calmly, almost distantly, but there was a hint of weariness in her voice. She said that there was an argument between her and Collin about the children. The operator remembered this call. The woman's voice sounded even, without alarm, but there was irritation in the intonation, as if this was not the first such conversation. When the officers arrived at the scene, they did not see anything unusual. There was no disorder in the house. There were no signs of violence. Collin looked tense, but not aggressive. Bree stood with her arms crossed, answering in monosyllables. The officers recorded the incident as a verbal misunderstanding and left the house. Everything looked settled, but in fact, it was only the first crack, a harbinger of the destructive wave that would cover this house a few hours later. By 5 p.m., the situation had changed. This time, Collin called 911. There was no longer the same composure in his voice. He spoke sharply, breaking down like a man on edge. The dispatcher recalled that his speech was choppy. He could not clearly explain exactly what had happened, but it was felt that he was very agitated. The police have arrived again. She entered the house again. Everything looked the same as it had a few hours ago. No signs of a struggle, no obvious signs of a threat. But something was wrong. The officers felt that the tension had reached a critical point. There was an oppressive silence in the house. Collin seemed worried, but assured that everything was under control. Bree looked distant, her gaze cold but firm. They claimed they could figure it out on their own. The police left the house, not even suspecting that this was their last chance to prevent a tragedy. At 6:22 p.m., another call came to 911. This time, Collin's voice didn't just sound tense, but scared. He spoke haltingly, jumping from one thought to another, but the dispatcher caught the main thing. He was locked in the garage, and Bree was trying to break his arm. The situation is out of control. And then, "She just shot me," a voice said. Then there was a noise, deaf, chaotic. Then there was another sound, like something heavy hitting a concrete floor, and the call ended. The officers tried to call back. There was no response. Just the beeps, repeating over and over again. An alarm signal was sent to the nearest patrol. The police knew that such calls were rarely false. When they arrived at the place, the house looked calm, the lights were on inside, but no one opened the door. And then they heard a sound, not screams, not footsteps, just the muffled sound of a baby crying. The officers knew that there was no time to rock up. They surrounded the house, talking in whispers. One knocked on the door. "The police! Open up!" There was no response. The tension grew, time stood still, and suddenly the door started to open. Bree Kuhn was standing in the doorway, without weapons, in ordinary home clothes. Her face remained impassive, her gaze distant. She looked like nothing had happened. The police didn't ask any questions. They knew that the time to understand what was happening would come later. Now, it was more important to make sure that the threat was over. Bree allowed herself to be handcuffed without resistance. Everything was happening too calmly, but there was a completely different sight waiting for them in the house. When the officers entered, the air seemed to freeze. There were children's toys on the table in the living room, and dinner was cooling on the stove. It looked like time had stopped here, but the atmosphere in the garage was completely different. Colleen Turner was lying on the concrete floor, several gunshot wounds, blood slowly spreading across the cold coating. The gun lying nearby would later turn out to be registered to Bree. The doctor's attempts to do something were useless. It was over before they arrived. When the body was taken out of the house, people had already gathered on the street. Someone was whispering. Someone was covering their mouth with their hands, not believing what was happening. Most of all, they were shocked by Bree's behavior. No tears, no emotions, no attempt to justify himself, just silence. Yesterday they were an ordinary family. Today it is a part of the criminal chronicle. After Bree Kuhn's arrest, she was taken to the local police station. She did not have to resist, she did not require a lawyer, did not try to justify herself, did not ask questions. It was as if she had known in advance that this moment would come. The officers accompanying her noted that there was no fear or remorse in her, only an inner emptiness that manifested itself in slow movements and a complete lack of emotions. The investigators understood from the very beginning that the motives of this crime would not be obvious. Everything looked different from the standard cases. In such situations, criminals either defended themselves fiercely or blamed circumstances for everything, sometimes showing regret. But here everything was different. Bree just remained silent, lost in herself, as if she had lived this moment in her head a long time ago. It seemed like she didn't need to realize what had happened, because she had already accepted its consequences a long time ago. Immediately after her arrival, she was put in an interrogation room. A lamp, a yellow light, a metal table, several sheets of paper in front of the investigator. The space pressed down, but not on her. Her gaze was fixed on a single point on the wall, and even when the investigator began to speak, she did not immediately turn her gaze to him. The answer to the first question was simple and straightforward. She knew she had committed a crime and did not deny it. There was no hesitation, no emotion, no excuses in her voice. Everything that happened next seemed to her unnecessary, secondary. The investigators' attention soon turned to the events leading up to the murder. They understood that the story did not develop in one day. It was necessary to figure out what was happening behind the closed doors of the Turner house, which processes led to the point of no return. Bree began her story. She spoke slowly, without pauses, as if she had learned this monologue by heart a long time ago. Her husband, Colleen Turner, was once a completely different person, cheerful, energetic, caring. He was the one she fell in love with, the man she wanted to build a family with. Their lives began like many others, with hopes, plans, and a desire to make each other happy. But the army changed him. When he returned from the service, something broke in him. There was tension in his eyes, his movements became sharper, and his silence lengthened. Over time, he began to move away. He stopped laughing the way he used to, became irritable, and sometimes he just retreated into himself, locked himself in the garage, and went for a run at night, rather than stay in silence. It took her a moment to realize that it wasn't just fatigue. At first it seemed that he just needed to rest, to get used to a normal life after the army. But over time, the alarm bells began to turn into something more. Sometimes he exploded over nothing. Sometimes he wouldn't talk to her for days at a time. Sometimes he just sat in the dark, staring at one point, and then suddenly got up and left, without explaining where. She thought she could handle it. She was trying to keep their family together, trying to make things better. She hid her anxiety from her children, from her friends, and even from herself. She didn't want to admit that their family was slowly but inevitably crumbling. Over time, it has become even more closed. The years of service and the experiences associated with them left a deep mark on him. She tried to convince herself that he was in control of himself, that he wouldn't do anything irreparable. But fear was growing inside her, not in front of him, but in front of what he was turning into. Her own job didn't allow her to be around as often as she would have liked. She served in the Navy, and her days were filled with a strict schedule, long shifts, and strict discipline. All this left no time for respite. But even after returning home, she couldn't relax. Her house has ceased to be a place of rest, turning into a battlefield between reality and the illusion of well-being. A few days before the tragedy, the tension reached its limit. The arguments were becoming more frequent, and the conversations became short and cold. They were no longer listening to each other. Each spoke without waiting for an answer. The children began to notice that something was wrong. One day she saw the eldest son asking the youngest daughter why mom and dad weren't smiling at each other anymore. She didn't know what to say. When that day came, she didn't think it would end like this. In the morning, everything looked familiar. Collin was restrained, but he didn't seem malicious. She was cooking breakfast. The kids were running around. No one imagined that this day would be the last in their former lives. First, there were the usual conversations, then the tension, which was growing by the minute. At some point, he raised his voice. Then came the first call to the police. When the officers arrived, he was already calm. Everything looked like a normal conflict. No one predicted that a few hours later, everything would happen again, but with a much more tragic outcome. She remembered that moment all too well. I remembered how he ended up in the garage. She remembered how there was a new intonation in his voice, which was different from anything she had heard before. There was no rage in that voice, no anger. There was something else. She knew that something had broken inside her at that moment. When the gun was in her hands, she didn't realize it until the end. She couldn't remember how she made that decision. Everything happened too fast. But at that moment in time, when she pulled the trigger, it seemed to her that this was the only possible outcome. There was complete silence after the shot. Even the children didn't make a sound. She just stood there, looking at what she had done. The investigator made several notes, closing the case. There were no more questions. She knew she was going to trial, she knew it would be a long process, but it didn't matter anymore. Everything that was supposed to happen has already happened. She was just waiting. Nobody knew what exactly. When the conversation reached the evening of September 8th, Bree froze. Her gaze blurred for a moment, as if memories had overwhelmed her, taking her back to the day she couldn't forget. She took a deep breath before starting to speak. This day started like so many others. The same habitual movements, the same conversations, the same attempt to create the illusion of normality. But everything was fragile, tension hung in the air, and one careless word was enough to cause an explosion. Their argument broke out instantly, but not because of anything serious, but because of parenting, a topic that had never led to such conflicts before. However, this time something went differently. She remembered how he started talking louder and louder, how his voice became shrill. Her heart was beating faster, and her fists were clenching. It seemed that this moment was inevitable, that it was bound to happen sooner or later. She could no longer hear individual words, only the intonation itself, harsh, domineering, oppressive. This was not the first dispute, but it was at that moment that she realized she couldn't take it anymore. Her patience snapped, resentment and disappointment burst out, flooding everything around her. She tried to find at least some rational explanation for what was happening, but her mind was no longer in control of the situation. A wave of anger washed over her, cold and blinding. She couldn't remember exactly what she said in response, but she knew there was something in her words that made him freeze. She felt herself trembling, but not from fear, from the fact that an uncontrollable rage was building up inside her, which had nowhere else to go. Then everything happened too fast. She couldn't remember the moment she picked up the gun. She just realized that he was in her hands, and her finger was already on the trigger. It wasn't a deliberate decision. It wasn't a planned action. It was just that something inside worked automatically. It was as if her body had made the decision for her. Flash, the sound of a gunshot, silence. There was no panic after that. She just stood there, looking at Collin, at his body, which was no longer moving. Everything happened so fast that her mind had not yet had time to process what she had just done. The room was quiet, so quiet that you could hear your own breathing. There was no relief or terror inside, just emptiness. The investigators asked questions, but only one of them mattered. She knew it was going to be asked, and when it happened, she wasn't surprised. Was she sorry? Yes, I was sorry, but not in the way that was expected of her. At that moment, it seemed to her that she simply had no other choice. She couldn't call it spontaneous, but she couldn't say it was a carefully thought-out act either. Rather, it was the culmination of years of tension, fear, and suppressed anger. She didn't try to justify herself. She didn't need any excuses. The investigators listened to her confession, studied her facial expression, her intonation. They understood that this was not a cold-blooded murderer, not a man who had been plotting revenge for a long time. In front of them was a woman who had been broken by circumstances, life, and fate itself. Everything that happened did not look like a violent crime, but like a tragic outcome that could have been avoided if someone had paid attention earlier. But no understanding could negate the fact of the murder. Officers working on this case have come across similar stories more than once. Cases where a victim becomes a criminal have always been the most difficult. It's easy to blame someone who acted with obvious brutality, but here it was different. There was a woman here who could no longer bear the burden that had become unbearable for her. But, despite this, the punishment was still going to follow. September 2024 marked the beginning of the trial of Bree Coon, accused of murdering her husband, Colleen Turner. This case caused a wide public outcry, spreading far beyond the Gulf breeze. The story of how a seemingly ordinary family ended up in the middle of a tragedy attracted the attention of not only local residents, but the entire country. The press followed the proceedings, leading news outlets published detailed materials about the process, and discussions broke out on social media in which opinions were divided. Some considered Bree a victim of circumstances, others a cold-blooded murderer. The courtroom was attended not only by journalists and relatives, but also by ordinary citizens who wanted to see the development of events firsthand. Their eyes were fixed on the defendant, whose face showed no emotion. She sat in the dock with her eyes downcast, clearly aware that her every gesture and every word would now be the subject of close scrutiny. The process promised to be difficult not only from a legal point of view, but also from an emotional one. It wasn't just a murder case. It was a trial that decided who Bree Coon really was, a desperate woman or a criminal who had taken her husband's life in cold blood. The defendant's lawyers based their strategy on the claim that their client had been subjected to abuse for many years and suffered from chronic stress. They presented her not as a murderer, but as a victim who, finding herself in a desperate situation, made the only possible decision. The main argument of the defense was that Bree Coon's family life was far from ideal. They presented evidence that her husband suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder caused by his service in the Marine Corps. Medical reports confirmed that he had suffered a head injury, and experts claimed that such injuries could lead to emotional instability, outbursts of aggression, and uncontrollable behavior. The defense emphasized that these changes in Collin's character made his wife's life unbearable. Excerpts from her diary entries were read out in the courtroom, where she described a constant feeling of fear, her fears for herself and her children. Lawyers referred to the syndrome of the cornered spouse, arguing that the woman saw no other way out but to protect herself. They claimed that at the time of the tragedy, Bree was in a state of extreme emotional shock, and her act was the result of many years of suppressed fear and helplessness. When Bree Coon came to the podium, a tense silence reigned in the hall. She spoke softly, but every breath she took, every pause, was filled with the weight of memories. She told me how she loved her husband, how she tried to save their family, how she hoped that everything would change. But every year she felt like she was losing herself. Her voice trembled as she talked about the fear of his outbursts, about the nights spent in anxiety, about countless attempts to find a way out. She confessed that she never wanted it to end like this, but that evening, when the argument turned into a threat, she could no longer hold back. Her words provoked a response from some of those present. Some listeners couldn't hold back their tears, sympathizing with the woman who had been living in fear for years. However, not everyone believed in the sincerity of her story. There were those who saw in it only an attempt to justify what they had done, manipulation in order to mitigate the punishment. The prosecutor's office had a different point of view. They argued that the defendant's actions were not an act of self-defense, but a carefully planned crime. The key evidence for the prosecution was an audio recording of Collin Turner's last call to 911. In the last minutes of his life, he told the operator that Bree had locked him in the garage and then fired a fatal shot. The prosecutor called this call irrefutable proof of the defendant's intent. Additionally, electronic correspondence was presented. in which an analysis of Bree's correspondence a few weeks before the tragedy showed that she had discussed the topic of violence and possible protection options in advance. These data became an argument in favor of the prosecution's version that the murder could have been premeditated. The prosecutor also emphasized that Bree had purchased a weapon several months before the tragedy, which, according to the prosecution, indicated that she had planned the crime in advance. The court heard the testimony of the witnesses. Neighbors claimed that they had heard frequent quarrels between the spouses, but no one could have thought that this would lead to tragedy. Some family friends said that Collin could really be short-tempered, but they had never noticed that he was violent towards his wife. Bree's colleagues, on the other hand, confirmed her stories that she looked depressed and exhausted. They recalled how she complained of fatigue and constant stress, but never openly said that she was afraid of her husband. In closing arguments, the defense lawyers urged the jury to look at Bree Kuhn not as a criminal, but as a woman who saw no other way out. They talked about the fear that had been poisoning her life for years, about the feeling of hopelessness that had become a daily occurrence for her. The prosecutors, in turn, recalled the 911 call, the purchased weapons, and the electronic correspondence, emphasizing that Bree had a choice, and she deliberately chose the path of violence. The jury retired to reach a verdict. The discussion lasted several hours, after which the decision was announced. Bree Kuhn was found guilty of first-degree murder. In October 2024, the court handed down a sentence: life imprisonment without the right to early release. There were 3 children of the couple in the house at the time of the incident. After their mother's arrest, 2 of them were placed under the custody of the Florida Department of Children and Families, and the third was transferred to his biological father. This case left an indelible mark not only in the life of the family, but also in society itself. It has become an occasion for new discussions about domestic violence, the limits of self-defense, and how deeply tragedies can hide behind closed doors. Bree Kuhn's story has become a reminder that behind every high-profile case lies a complex, multi-layered reality in which there are not always clear answers.